Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church, a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California.
We meet in person on Sundays at Joslyn Park, 633 Kensington Road. And we pre-record parts of our service to share with you here online.
We like to talk about taking steps here at Sola Church. You step in when you watch Sola Church online. That's all about knowing God. You step out when you participate in a virtual small group. That's all about finding freedom. And you step up when you serve at church and in the community. That's all about discovering your purpose and making a difference.
And today you've taken that first step, and we're so glad you're here. Let's get into our time of worship.
And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your perfect love is casting out fear. And even when I'm caught in the middle of the storms of this life, I won't turn back, I know you are near. And I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. And if my God is with me, whom then shall I fear? Whom then shall I fear? Oh no, you never let go, through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, you never let go, every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go, Lord, you never let go of me. And I can see a light that is coming for the heart that holds on. A glorious light beyond all compare. And there will be an end to these troubles, but until that day comes, I live to know you here on the earth. And I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. And if my God is with me, whom then shall I fear? Whom then shall I fear? Oh no, you never let go, through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, you never let go, every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go, Lord, you never let go of me. Oh no, you never let go, through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, you never let go, every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go, Lord, you never let go of me. Yes, I can see the light that is coming for the heart that holds on. There will be an end to these troubles, but until that day comes, still I will praise you. Still I will praise you. Oh no, you never let go, through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, you never let go, every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go, Lord, you never let go of me. Oh no, you never let go, through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, you never let go, every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go, Lord, you never let go of me. Lord, you never let go.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out today, please don't feel obligated to give. But if Sola Church is your church home, or you just want to help us accomplish our mission to be a life-giving church here on the West Side, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to schedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to look for the link in your chat feed. But you can also go to solachurch.life and look for the tab at the top that says Give.
With your gifts, you're making a difference in one of the most creative, influential places in the country. You know, I've read a lot about people of faith canceling streaming services and so forth out of concerns about content. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that anybody cancel anything, but I keep thinking about that saying, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Here on the west side of Los Angeles, we're rubbing elbows with people who work in the entertainment industry. And I think sometimes, like, what if people were to go to our website, solachurch.life, click give, and actually schedule a recurring gift, weekly, monthly, whatever, in the amount of a streaming service subscription. Enough cursing the darkness, let's light some candles.
Yeah.
Something to think about.
That is so good. And earlier you were talking about taking steps at Sola Church. So maybe you can talk about the second step, stepping out.
Yeah, it's so awesome when people step in and watch Sola Church online, but we really want to encourage you then to step out and participate in one of our virtual small groups. In addition to the in-person group that we have here in Los Angeles on Tuesday evenings, we have 2 virtual groups. So one starts at 5 p.m. Pacific. It's perfect for those of you who are in the Central or Eastern time zones. That starts at 7 or 8 respectively. And then we have a second virtual group that starts at 6:30 Pacific. So that's great for anybody that's in the Pacific time zone, but not close enough to attend in person, or even in the Mountain time zone, starting at 6:30, or sometimes if you're 7:30 Mountain. We would love so much to get you plugged into one of the groups. We talk about the weekend message in these groups, and there's an emphasis on application. It's just really, really meaningful. So for information, just shoot us an email at info@solachurch.life.
We love our small groups.
Yeah.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
By now, you've probably heard about shrinkflation. This is where manufacturers, rather than raising their prices, are just lowering the quantity. And it was bad enough already. You'd buy a box like this, and inside would be a bag like that, and inside would be about that much stuff. Well, it's only getting worse. We live in a world where things aren't what they appear to be, where things are fake, and where sometimes people are phony, and no one is immune. In the Bible, this is called hypocrisy. Let's turn to Mark chapter 7 in the New Testament. We're in a message series called Convergence. It's a verse-by-verse study through the gospel according to Mark. When 2 or more things come together, we say that they converge. And so on the pages of Mark's gospel, we see eternity converge with time. We see heaven converge with earth. We see God converge with man. And that happens right here in this online space too. Our title today is Keep It Real. We want to talk about ways that we're phony and about how to be true. So first, ways we're phony. Look with me at Mark 7, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him," to Jesus, "having come from Jerusalem. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches." Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" Well, meet the Pharisees. I was talking to a friend who had seen Peter Pan, in live theater. And whenever Captain Hook took the stage, the whole audience literally booed and hissed. And it was at that moment that the actor stopped, turned to the audience and said, "I haven't done anything yet." Of course, the whole audience erupted in laughter because they weren't expecting the actor to address them like that. But it's like this for us with the Pharisees. Like as soon as they enter the story, we want to boo, we want to hiss, but maybe there's more about them that we could learn. The Pharisees were an ancient fraternity, roughly 6,000 strong in the time of Jesus. And the word Pharisee, or the name Pharisee, actually means separate. So they were separatists. They practiced separatism. At Sola Church, we talk about how everyone should belong. We're talking about a big tent. Well, they had a very small tent, like it was big enough for just them and no one else. And we see that Jesus had been butting heads with them repeatedly already in the Gospel of Mark. They've butted heads over fasting. They've butted heads over Sabbath observance, and now over hand washing. Now, this wasn't just a matter of hygiene or even a matter of manners. It was a matter of tradition. You notice that phrase, tradition of the elders, in verses 3 and 5. They basically had this concept of the fence. Here's what I mean. If in the Torah there was a law, we'll call it a rule, and God said, that the line is here. The idea was that the farther you could stay away from that line, the better. That makes sense, right? So what they would do is, to protect this rule, they would make another rule. This rule would be called the fence. So that if you never crossed this line, well, you'd never be in danger of crossing that line. The problem is that whereas this was God's rule, this was man's rule. This was tradition. And so over hundreds of years, these oral traditions had piled up. They were eventually collected and codified in the Mishnah around 200 AD. And I mean no disrespect to the Mishnah. It's an amazing document, an amazing book, lots of good stuff there. But it was, all of these oral traditions that had been combined and put there. So in the law, when it talked about hand washing, it was with regard to priests at the temple. But the fence made it about people at the table. And notice that they had to wash their hands in a special way. At the start of the COVID pandemic, there was such an emphasis on hand washing. Remember how, they told us how long to wash. We had to wash, like sing happy birthday twice. That was long enough. I read about one guy that got sick of singing happy birthday, so he started washing his hands while humming the Imperial Death March. Dun, 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 dun. I thought that was pretty awesome. But just like, there was a particular way that we were to do that. We were supposed to go all the way to the bottoms of our hands, and they emphasized around the fingernails and all that. Well, there was a very particular way that these guys were supposed to wash their hands. They had to use a very specific quantity of water. And then they had to hold their hands up so that the water would run down to just the right point. And then they had to hold their hands down so the water would run right back off. And they did this not only before but after meals. And not only before and after meals, they did it between courses. And if they did it wrong, they had to do it again. So in verse 6, Jesus answered them. He answered and said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do." Now notice that word hypocrites in verse 5. For a person of faith, man, that's the H-bomb. Like, there are a lot of slurs that people could hurl at us, but perhaps the one that stings the most is hypocrite. But the word had more meaning for them than it does for us. To us, a hypocrite is someone who doesn't practice what they preach, for example. But for them, a hypocrite was an actor. That's what they called actors, hypocrites. And so the hypocrites were, actors who wore masks. These masks had exaggerated features so that the facial expression could be seen from a distance. And many of these masks, were actually manufactured in such a way that it helped to amplify the voice of the person speaking. So the idea isn't then just someone who doesn't practice what they preach, but it's someone wearing a mask. It's someone pretending to be something other than what they are. Jesus, in calling them hypocrites, quotes Isaiah 29, verse 13. And he suggests that they're hiding their true selves, that they're hiding behind their traditions. In verse 9, Jesus said to them, "All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, 'Whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban,' that is,
a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down. And many such things you do. So Jesus gives another example in addition to hand washing. In this case, the law, Jesus quotes the 5th commandment that you're supposed to honor your father and your mother. Then as now, that was understood to mean that you took care of them, elder care, that you made sure that their needs were met, their physical and material needs were met. But the fence that had been created was this whole Corban thing. They could dedicate their estate to God, whether they were, going to give it now or not until some future time, or whether they were actually ever going to give it at all. They could declare it Corban, and then, because they had devoted it to God, they were told they shouldn't give any of it to their parents. So it's an interesting thing because in the first example, hand washing, the fence was intended to keep people from breaking the law. But in the second example, elder care, caring for one's parents, at the end of their life, the fence was actually a workaround, enabling people to break the law. And so again, they were hiding behind their traditions. Now, so let's talk about ways that we're phony. One way that we're phony is by hiding our true selves, behind perhaps a veneer, behind outward appearances, behind some sort of, outward compliance, hiding our true selves. It's our response to peer pressure. It's the reason for our people pleasing. It's why we hide on a first date and a second and a third, maybe years after we're married. It's why we hide at a job interview. So tell us about your strengths and weaknesses. It's why we're phony around people we like a lot. And it's why we're phony around people we don't like at all. Does your life revolve around what people think? Are you hiding in some way? At home, at work, or school, at church? Let's go back and just reemphasize a couple things in verse 2. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. And in verse 5, then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? So in verse 2, you'll notice that they found fault. And this is what phonies do. Phonies are fault finders. People who are themselves hiding are usually very cynical of others. And the fault finding that they do with other people is so often just them projecting. But the problem is that when we're living this way, when we're doing this, we're comparing ourselves with others. We're contrasting ourselves with others. In some way, we're competing with other people. This leads us to another way that we're phony. Not just that we're hiding our true selves, but we're spying in this, attempt to compete with other people. It's a kind of voyeurism. In a community of faith, it's like spiritual voyeurism. But we're so fascinated with what other people are doing, aren't we? Like in life in general. Psychologists say that it's one of the reasons why people are so fascinated by celebrity magazines. They say that it's why we're so fascinated with reality TV and now for that matter with social media. I mean, on social media, we're constantly looking at the lives of other people, or at least what we suppose is some sort of a representation of their lives. These psychologists say that we're hoping we're no different. That maybe we're hoping that they're no different than us, or even that they're not as good as us. How strange, right? Our unhappiness with others really has everything to do with our unhappiness with ourselves. Does your life revolve around what others think? Do you live with like a constant fear of exposure? Or are you always second guessing yourself, like what you said or what you did or how it was perceived? Are you easily embarrassed? Do you find yourself telling lots of little white lies? Do you find yourself feeling jealous a lot? There's a good chance that you're dealing with phoniness. Today we're talking about keeping it real. We've touched on some ways that we're phony. How sometimes we're hiding, how other times we're spying. Let's talk a little bit about how to be true. Verse 14, it says, when he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears, let him hear. Now you notice that word hear 3 times in the verses I just read. We saw it in verse 14 and then twice in verse 16. So one way that we can be true is listening. Let me explain. And listening is sort of an alternative to spying. Instead of spying on others, we need to listen to God. Several weeks ago in a message here at Sola Church Online, I asked the question, who do you listen to? And when our lives revolve around what others think, we're listening to them. That's what the Bible calls the fear of man. But when our lives revolve around what God thinks, we're listening to him. That's what the Bible calls the fear of God. It's funny because, in an in-person church service with a live audience, they're watching me speak, but I'm watching them listen. Some people take notes, which is a good thing to do. Other people pass them. Talking about, many, many years now of speaking in front of live audiences. And I've seen people, like write a little note, pass it, and the other person answer and pass it back. Who knows what it says? I'm hungry. Are you? Yes, no. Yes. What should we have for lunch? Chinese, Mexican, Italian, pass it back. So some people take notes, other people pass them. Some people listen with their elbows. What I mean by that is that anytime they hear something that they think the other person needs to hear, they're just throwing an elbow. Elbow here, elbow there, elbows everywhere. Listening with their elbows. And then some people listen with their eyes, by which I mean they listen by looking at the back of their eyes, and maybe they're not listening at all. Well, Jesus said something interesting about these Pharisees in another place. In Matthew 15, verse 14, he referred to them as blind guides leading the blind. They had blind spots. They were blinded by pride. They were know-it-alls. But we have blind spots too. There's always that person that thinks, not me. I don't have a blind spot. Well, why do you think they call it a blind spot? It's because we can't see it. The truth is that because of our need to hide, because of our desire to spy, we can actually start creating like different personas for different parts of our lives. There's like who we are at work or who we are at school. There's who we are at home. There's who we are at church. There's who we are online, who we are on social media. And eventually it can get difficult to even remember like who we are at which of these places. The lines can start to get blurred in our own minds between, like the fantasy and the reality. It can get very, very tricky. We no longer know what's real and what isn't. But that's why we need to be humble, why we need to be teachable. This is where listening comes in. We need to listen to God. We need to take our cues from God. Notice in verse 17, when he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? And he said, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. And you notice the reference to the disciples in verse 17. Matthew tells us that it was actually Peter who was sort of the spokesman for the group in this case. But I want to just draw your attention to something else as well in verse 19, where it talks about purifying all foods. Now, in the New King James Version, that's included between the quotation marks. So those words are attributed to Jesus. And it's possible that Jesus said those words, thus purifying all foods. It's more likely, though, that that's Mark's commentary on what Jesus said, that perhaps Jesus' quote should end immediately before that, and that Mark is then giving his commentary and pointing out that in saying what he did, Jesus purified all foods or declared all foods clean. In other words, that this lifted the obligation to follow the dietary laws of the Old Testament, those dietary laws that are found in the Torah. Keep in mind that Mark's source, as I said last week, Mark was not an eyewitness like, say, Matthew or John. So Mark needed a source, and Mark's source was Peter. Traditionally, we understand Peter to be Mark's source. And of course, God had revealed this very thing to Peter in Acts chapter 10. So it's a cool thing, though, that at lunch today, hey, go for the pork ribs if you want to. But notice in verse 14, it says this word understand. And in verse 18, this word understanding. Another way that we can be true is understanding what Jesus is saying here, understanding this very important lesson. And this is an alternative to hiding. If we're listening in the previous point, then we don't have to be spying on other people. If we understand what Jesus is saying here, we don't have to be hiding from other people. We could talk about the dietary laws. We could talk about the ceremonial rules of the Old Testament. Those are things that obviously were important and valuable and had their place. Let's just make the observation that they are things that are on the outside. They are things that people can see. And it's relatively easy to comply in those outward ways. It's relatively easy to follow rules so that we can appear to be a certain way, to be a certain kind of person, to have a certain lifestyle, without actually being transformed on the inside. And so you notice that word heart appears 3 times in our text this morning. It's in verses 6, 19, and 21. It's been said, and it's true, that the heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. I love it in Jeremiah 17, verse 9. It says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Well, the answer comes in the following verse. In verse 10, it says, I, the Lord, search the heart. So God knows our hearts. He knows the truth about us. If reputation is what people think about us, well, character is what God knows about us. Reputation is what people think we are. Character is who we are in truth. And one thing that, we all learn as we make our way through life is that if we focus only on our reputation, we're likely to lose our character. But if we focus on our character, our reputation usually, to a large degree, takes care of itself. We need to be less concerned with reputation, more concerned with character, less concerned with who people think I am, and more concerned with who God knows I am, with who God says I am. And God is working in our lives from the inside out, moving us in the direction that He wants us to go, making us in truth, in reality, the people that He wants us to be. You know what? We can keep it real. We don't have to hide our true selves because God loves us and accepts us. We don't have to spy on others, comparing and contrasting, because we're not competing for their approval. Our validation comes from God. God who's for us and not against us. So be yourself. Be who you are. Be yourself at church. Be yourself in your day-to-day life. Be open. Be honest. Be transparent. Be vulnerable. And accept others. Give grace to others. Keep it real. Father, thank you for the insights that we can gather from this passage. I just pray, Lord, that you would help us to see those parts of our lives where maybe we're hiding our true selves from others, or maybe we're trying to create an impression that's different than the reality. I pray, Lord, too, that you would show us those areas where maybe we've been guilty of spying on others. Maybe we've been guilty of spiritual voyeurism, comparing and contrasting to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, competing for the approval of other people. I pray instead that you would help us this week and going forward to listen, not for what they would say, but for what you would say. Help us to take our cues, not from them, but from you. And help us, Lord, to understand this truth that you're concerned about the heart. Lord, that outward conformity is not the ticket. It's not what you're wanting for us. It's not that outward confirmation, but it's that inward transformation. Lord, I just pray that you would free us from this need to create contrived rules, taking some one thing that you said and turning it into 10, 20 things that we think that we or others have to do. Help us to get back to the simple, basic things that you've actually said in your word. And help us, Lord, not to settle for some sort of an artificial spirituality that's just based on these traditions or these man-made rules, but instead to want to get to the heart of things, to want to be transformed deep down inside. Lord, I pray that our focus could be on allowing you, by the power of your Holy Spirit, to produce Christ-like character in us. And then when it comes to what other people think, just that we would let the chips fall where they may. That we would trust that in time, for the most part, our reputation is going to follow right along behind our character. We're so thankful, Lord, that we're accepted in you, that we're loved by you, that you're for us. Thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed this online service. And to learn more about Sola Church, you can go to solachurch.life.
As always, I want to encourage you to connect with us on social media. On our YouTube channel, you can subscribe, but also look for @Sola Church LA on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You know, we were talking about steps today. You step in when you watch Sola Church online, you step out when you participate in a virtual small group, and you step up when you serve at church and in the community. Just want to encourage you to step up this week. Like, look for a way this week that you can serve your community, that you can make a difference wherever you are, wherever you're watching from.
And we hope everyone has a great week, and we will see you next week at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody.